Today, we're going to be covering UTM tracking and our best practices around what you should and shouldn't do for your UTMs to make them both consistent and useful later for data analytics. We're going to go over deploying tracking everywhere that you can find it. And we're going to show on how to implement server-side tracking in some of the major platforms. Jonathan's here to talk through deploying UltraCart Analytics, which is the first step if you have any sites or pages outside of UltraCart that you're running traffic to.
So UltraCart Analytics is a tracking system that we've developed over the last 6 years. And the purpose of it is to help glue together tracking data. So if you're currently using storefronts to power everything, so if www.yourdomain.com is pointed at UltraCart storefronts, then all of the wiring and plumbing for UltraCart Analytics is done automatically for you. Likewise, if you're using our WordPress plugin to power your WordPress site, and then it's handing off to the storefront for the checkout only, that will also deploy UltraCart Analytics automatically. So really, this section here is if you are using your own external site and you're simply using UltraCart for the checkout. So www.yourdomain.com is pointed at your your web server, and secure.yourdomain.com is the UltraCart checkout. So in this case, we would recommend you go to docs.ultracart.com and you're going to search on using UltraCart Analytics. And that's going to take you to a large amount of documentation on how to deploy this. There's 3 ways to do it. And those sections in the table of contents that you're going to want to see are tracking on an external website or tracking on an external website with Google Tag Manager. And if you're using Tag Manager already, you can go ahead and deploy the script using Tag Manager to your site, or you can just take the script it gives you and deploy it. So as we go through the rest of this webinar and we're talking about server-side tracking, we're going to have the assumption that you've deployed UltraCart Analytics to your site. Now, this is a highly available serverless data collection. It's not going to slow down your site at all, but it is going to do that data collection. And more importantly, it's going to help solve the problem of tracking that customer as they move between domains. So I'll hand that back over to Chris.
Great. So UTM, being consistent with UTMs is one of the most difficult things that we see with our clients. There's a wonderful site called urlmacros.com that does a really good job of helping you build clean, consistent UTM parameters for all the major ad platforms. For some reason, they don't include Google Ads in that. We'll be covering that for consistent. One thing that we find is that most people use standard campaign or ad group actual names, English names in their UTM campaigns, ad groups, and IDs and ad sets. And the problem with that is it becomes very, very difficult later to match that data up with real data. So we believe the best practices is to always inject the IDs, the numeric IDs for campaign ad sets and ads into URLs, and then use additional parameters after those for more human readable content. For Google Ads, you set UTM parameters at the account level. And this is the current setup that we like, that we find works the most consistently with UltraCart Analytics and BigQuery. Any of this we can share later, and we're welcome to send this stuff out. So if anyone has any requests on this, we're happy to send this out. So for Google Ads, you set that at the account level under admin and account settings, and that's where you set your tracking. And that'll apply to all your ads for Google Ads. For Meta ads, it's a lot more confusing because they make you set that at each ad as you create the ad. So it's very, very easy to get inconsistent URL parameters set. So starting with a clean template and then working forward with that always makes a huge difference. For it, again, we really like to put in the IDs of each of the major parameters. That way it makes it a lot easier to understand later and match later that data to the real world. TikTok and Pinterest work very similar. Again, all about IDs and the dynamic URL or the dynamic ID injections. And that site I referenced earlier really helps in identifying these and putting them in consistently. Server side is where things get interesting. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, and I'll let him talk a little bit more about it. When you use server side tracking, you get significantly better performance. And I'll let Jonathan take it from there.
So one of the landscape changes that has come about over the last few years is the enforcement of privacy policies related to cookies, cookie lifetime, storage, and things of that nature from popular platforms like iOS. A lot of our merchants have a huge customer base that's going to be browsing on their mobile iPhone. And so those enforcement policies can dictate the effectiveness of ad tracking. You may have heard the terms ITP 1.0 and 2.0. Those are the actual guidelines that Apple implemented. So in response to that, the advertising industry has shifted more towards a server-side tracking mechanism to overlay the standard cookie-based tracking. Think of it as connect the dots. So every time a customer clicks on an advertisement, the URL parameters on that are going to have click identifiers. And then those need to be collected, stored, and then ultimately when the payment is processed on the order, we need to send that information back to the advertising platform, letting them know that a particular conversion converted. So there's server-side tracking for GA4 and Google AdWords, as well as Facebook and some other platforms. Each of these has its own setup instructions. So we have put here on this slide under documentation, if you go to docs.ultracart.com and you search each of those strings, it will take you to the associated documentation. The other benefit about server-side tracking is that we can do it asynchronously. The customer's browser is already gone when a payment happens offline. Let's say you hold an order for fraud review. You know, you're just like, don't know, is this a duplicate order or not? You process the payment a couple hours later, we can still fire that conversion. So in the old world of no server-side tracking, you never attributed that sale. With server-side tracking, you can funnel that conversion data to them exactly when the payment happens. So that communication between our servers and the network, the advertising network, that's going to be captured in our integration log system. So likewise, if you search docs.ultracart.com for integration logs, you'll see the integration log framework. We're logging every single request and response that's going to that network. You can see the exact payloads we're delivering and the responses we're getting. It's also important to note that it's a great idea to have someone in your organization configured to receive the daily email for integration log errors, as well as they can put the widget on their dashboard and keep an eye on or their finger on the pulse to make sure that errors are not occurring. You know, you don't want to let the errors go on autopilot until you get to an end of the month or something and you're analyzing your data and you realize, uh-oh, we weren't reporting advertising tracking. The other benefit to closing the loop with server-side tracking is it's going to drive the algorithms on these networks because you're going to have higher return on ad spend. So it's very important to implement these as opposed to just relying on a standard pixel.
When we've tested this, particularly in Google, we've seen Google does some of the very best tracking we've found, particularly when it's search, shopping a little less so, YouTube very, very low in terms of pixel side tracking. When we've implemented server side tracking, we've seen a jump between 10 and 30 or 40% higher attribution backed campaigns with server-side tracking implemented. There's a lot of ways to do server-side tracking. There's a lot of external platforms out there that people have used. People have used Google Tag Manager for this a lot. It's very complicated to set up. And the UltraCart setup is significantly cleaner and far more reliable. And we'll go through a couple of the major use cases here. Don't be surprised if you go to the documentation and what you see in the ad platform is different than what you see in the documentation. We've seen the platforms seem to change how you do this almost daily, it feels like. So it's likely that there's slight differences, and contact UC support or scaling, and we're happy to get that taken care of quite quickly. We do it a lot. Google Analytics is one of the things people don't think about for server-side tracking. People are usually thinking about their ad platforms. And we found adding Google Analytics server-side vastly improves its performance. To do that, it's a little complicated in Google Analytics 4. You'll already have a data stream. And in that data stream, you click Measurement API Protocol Secrets here. You may have to accept some data privacy checkboxes in the process. Once you go to that, you generate a new API secret here, and that gives you a secret value that you can then put in UltraCart. You put that underneath privacy and tracking for each storefront that Google Analytics is tracking, and you put that in here. We also put the default Google Analytics tracking here. It's important to think through and look through the options UltraCart has for Google Analytics. Some of these are very, very powerful. They may not be right for your business, so it's worth talking through. But it's very powerful to put this stuff in, and then you get far, far better tracking. Meta server-side tracking also is always slightly complicated. Under your data sources, which used to be called pixels, you should be able to scroll down within any given data source or pixel to the conversions API. Usually when you're setting this up, there's a lot of confusing dialogues that pop up about connecting to external platforms for the conversion API. You don't need any of those. You simply click this generate access token, which you should see here under setup direct integration, slightly blurry. That will generate a key, and that key goes into the other tab within your storefront tracking, and you can put that server side here along with your conversion pixel. And I always recommend clicking most of the standard events unless some simply just don't apply to your business. Google, we found there's a best practice we found for Google that's a little bit different. Google relies very, very heavily on their click ID that comes through as a UTI parameter. I believe it's GCLID or yeah. And that Google, unlike Facebook, Google will actually allow you later to see what exact click ID, which is unique to every click, what campaign it was associated with, and you're actually allowed to upload an order directly to that click ID so that you can control very tightly what you're sending Google for a conversion. To set that up, you go to your file manager within the storefront. You'll see a feeds folder. If you've sent traffic, if the feeds folder does not exist, you haven't sent any paid traffic to it, that will automatically generate these CSV files. And they have a lot of different power here. You can give it first click, last click. We generally tend to do none, which is we let Google do the attribution on their side. So when we say Google none, we give them that. You take that feed ID, you set it up in Google itself, in your tracking, and you set it to upload that feed. We do it 2 to 3 times a day. That uploads the click ID against the order ID and gives very, very, very reliable tracking. It also allows you to, down the road, do more customized things with your tracking using BigQuery, which is a subject of another webinar we'll be doing in the future. A lot of power there, and it makes a gigantic difference. TikTok also has a server-side tracking that we have here at Scaling not yet got to implement because we don't currently use TikTok in our campaigns. However, we plan to be implementing that heavily for several clients, so we can follow up with that with anyone that has any questions. Jonathan, you want to talk about view-through tracking versus click-through tracking?
Sure. So with server-side tracking, let's take TikTok, for example. Every time an order happens, we're going to send them a payload. That payload will have a click ID if we observed an actual TikTok click, but we will also send them standardized and hashed data from the customer, such as their first name, last name, that type of information. And the hashing prevents you from actually sending PII data to the network, but they're able to match that up because they know the hash of their customers as well. So the network will identify the customers of TikTok or Facebook. They'll determine if they showed that that customer an advertisement of yours. And then if that ad has shown within a certain amount of time, the attribution window, typically 7 days, then they are going to claim credit for that sale. They're going to say to themselves, oh, we showed the customer an advertisement for this product. They probably went on their desktop and entered the site and purchased, so we get credit for it. So that's called a view-through attribution. You have to decide how much value that you place in view-through attribution. For example, if you're constantly advertising on Facebook and showing your ads, and your existing customers are both on Facebook seeing those ads and just coming and purchasing from you on a regular basis, then Facebook's going to claim credit for those ads generating those sales. So it's probably one of the more complicated discussion points of advertising spend is how much credit you give to view-through tracking, and should you be advertising, and how should you be advertising to your existing customer base. I don't know if Chris has any specific horror stories, but I know we specifically have seen people spend a lot of Facebook money on targeting their existing customers who are loyal and are going to be coming back and purchasing regardless.
We've
So,
seen,
oh, go ahead.
we've seen a lot of it. In fact, it's one of the things we typically do for almost all of our clients is do some level of data work around matching up the data that's within BigQuery that's tracked with those click IDs and all the UTM parameters that we have stored against the actual orders, and then look at, are those orders new customers? Are they repeat customers? And start to look at the comparison of what Facebook's saying or Google's saying or TikTok is saying in terms of the conversions that happened against actual clicks to conversions that we observe. And sometimes it varies very much by account and market and tactics. We've seen view through conversions be as much as 3 to 4 times higher than observed conversions. And it generally, when we do see that, we tend to be able to help customers reduce their spend significantly to better focus on actual conversions rather than view through conversions. Although view through conversions are a real thing and they're important for the platforms for optimization, but they need to be audited against actual conversions. And as Jonathan alluded to and I mentioned earlier, it's also incredibly important to be looking at the conversions that we did observe. Are they new or are they returning customers? Because that can very much influence what you're doing on a campaign by campaign basis.
So when we talk about, comprehensive analytics tracking, there's a couple of different areas that you can look at your data. So the first one is on the order record. You're looking not only at which items are selling, but on that same order record, you can see the UTMs that are associated with that particular customer, as well as, and we'll show you in the next slides, we're collecting the page view history. So you can see the actual page clicks that each customer went through and what were the parameters on those URLs. And it's not atypical for merchants to be a little shocked when they see what their actual traffic looks like on a per order basis. All of the data that you hear us talking about, you see analytics collecting, we drive all that into a table in BigQuery. It's a very big table in your BigQuery because it's got a lot of data, but that data stream is actually provided to you in BigQuery. So the first aspect is the page view history. So if you're looking at an order inside of UltraCart, you've looked it up under View All Orders, you can hover over Diagnostics and then click Page View History as shown in the left-hand screenshot. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring up a list of each URL, when they clicked on it, how long they spent on it, and most importantly, the parameters that were on that page. And so in this particular example, you can see that we collected all the UTM parameters associated with a Klaviyo email campaign. And then you can watch the customer as they move through to other pages during their browsing experience. So, not only can you see all that data, if you're deploying UltraCart Analytics for the first time on your external site, this is a critical page for you to visit as you start getting order flow to make sure that UltraCart Analytics is observing the traffic end to end. Because if we're not seeing it yet on your external website, then we're not going to be able to collect up those click IDs, etc. Generally speaking, if you're using a standard buy link on your external website, the script will daisy chain all the proper tracking identifiers to cross the domains. If you're not seeing it track correctly, go ahead and reach out to UltraCart support and open up a case, and we'll look at your website, how you're presenting your call to action and the code, and we'll make some recommendations on things you can enhance. And then the next thing is just keeping an eye on the UTM parameters. As Chris was saying, one of the important things is you start tracking all the UTM parameters associated with your orders. So for a lot of merchants, just starting to add UTM parameters is a big deal. They realize, oh, I need to start consistently tagging all of my inbound paid traffic sources. So that's pay-per-click advertising, that's email advertising, it's any type of advertising. When you're looking at an order, down below the order, you can actually see a list of the UTM parameters that were actually interacted with. So in this is actually a fairly typical scenario where the customer over a 7-hour period interacted with Google. They interacted with an email campaign they had received, Google a second time, Facebook, and went back and looked at another email they had received. So sometimes you have hit customers with marketing on different channels, and it turns into one big funnel. So in this case, you can actually visualize that funnel by seeing all the data that's in there. So, when you're looking at an order in UltraCart, you can quickly identify, wow, this order came through 5 different marketing channels, and what were they? And all this data is going to be driven down into your BigQuery, where you could do further analysis on it. But one thing to note is every one of these networks, so in this case, Klaviyo, Facebook, Google, are all going to claim full credit for that sale. They're not gonna have any knowledge that this sale was actually contributed to by 3 different marketing channels. The burden to spread attribution, that's put squarely on the merchant.
That's incredibly important. And that's what we see a lot when we audit. And that's what makes BigQuery so powerful, is because you can start really analyzing those sorts of attribution paths and finding who is what was the originator of the customer of that sale, and what happened going forward. So UTM parameters, and as you can see here, it's incredibly important to have consistency in what UTM parameters you're using on all the different platforms. A good example here is, as you can see in Facebook, they're using campaign ID here, which is very clean. Klaviyo doesn't give you that option. And as you can see, you get a campaign, which is the full name of the campaign you sent in Klaviyo. It's great for human readability, but it's very, very difficult later to match up against specific things. If you use standard campaign name injections in Facebook, you'll see the same sort of long strings of characters that are very, very difficult later to programmatically match up.
It's also worth noting, we don't have it mentioned in this slide, but one thing UltraCart Analytics will also do is it will collect up another set of parameters called ITMs, and internal marketing. So anywhere you're using a UTM, you can also put a ITM underscore. So you could do ITM underscore campaign and make up your own identifier.
Mhm.
Now we will collect that. You'll have to decide, and that kind of is the whole bigger discussion is how do you marry that up later on
That's right.
for further analysis. So ITMs are also available and supported if you're into that.
Absolutely. And again, consistency is the absolute key. Jonathan, you want to talk about slug-based fallback, or would you like me to?
Sure. So we've observed traffic that we know for a fact had to come through a marketing channel and not just standard search engine traffic. So one of the problems that we're starting to observe is other privacy-based software or browser profiles are stripping out the UTM parameters because the privacy software understands that that's being used to track the customer. And so they're stripping out that data. So you might end up with an ad click, but it has no UTM data. And so you start to fly blind. It's not a massive problem yet, but it's one that we see increasing. So we came up with UTM shortcodes as a solution. And when you're using a storefront to host everything, you can put the shortcode at the end. And that's going to let you configure a shortcode. And then when we see that traffic, if the UTM parameters did not exist, then we will inject the ones that you've configured. So think of it as like backup tracking. If you are not using storefronts to power everything, you can include the shortcode as the USC parameter, and we'll do that as well. And inside of the BigQuery UTM record, we'll actually give you a Boolean flag to tell you whether we used that backup tracking or not. So BigQuery makes it kind of easy to analyze and see the impact of that. So, it also lets you put ad links out there. Like, let's say you have a particular advertising campaign and you don't want it to appear like it's a marketing and tracking campaign with a bunch of URL parameters on it. Maybe you have an influencer doing marketing for you in a newsletter. You can use this shortcode as a stealth way of doing all your UTM tracking. So there's a couple of nice benefits there, and definitely something that people should explore.
To talk about this a little bit more and how it works, we observed this on one of our clients where their demographic tends to do a lot of strange browsers that are privacy focused, lots of privacy VPN type stuff, and cookie blockers. They tend to be really worried about tracking. And that's great, but it makes marketing and actually servicing those customers very, very difficult. So the idea of this was that particularly, and also in platforms like YouTube, which almost always strip all UTMs out that you've put in. You can put in, and we usually recommend doing this at the campaign level, unless you have some very, very specific things you're trying to do. So if you have a YouTube campaign, you could put YT as your short code and then fill out your UTMs at the level that makes sense. So that would probably be source would be probably Google, and medium might be YouTube, and campaign might be campaign 1. And once that's saved, by simply putting YT as the end path of your site, you can get there. So if we used clinical effects as an example, if we sent people to clinical effects /YT, now it does have to be different than any other path that's in your storefront, or you will cause conflicts. But by doing that, while there's no UTM parameters, the UTM parameters are collected on that session and on the orders, and you're later able to match that up. For some of our clients, it's increased performance of our tracking, at least to the campaign level, by, in the case of YouTube, 100%, because there was 0 before, and now we're seeing 70 to 80% of sessions at least attributable back to the campaign. So it makes a very, very big difference and needs to be deployed carefully, but is incredibly powerful. One more thing I'd like to show you is some of the data within BigQuery that's available. So this is on the UC orders table, and you can see here there's a UTM's subsection. This is a JSON, a nested record of all of the clicks that on the order record that had UTM parameters. You can even see here if the short code was used as backup and if it's involved. As Jonathan mentioned, there's ITMs, there's all the UTMs, there's all the click IDs from the various platforms, from Google through Bing to Facebook to TikTok. V, I don't know what V is actually.
Verizon Media.
Verizon Media.
When Verizon owned Yahoo.
And then
rest in peace.
Interesting. Veeam, that's a new one. And then some attribution abilities where you can actually take the total or the subtotal of the order and have different attributions spread across those observed UTM codes. This is incredibly useful and is one of the things we do a lot where we match up the true campaign data versus actual order data and does a really good job of that.
Yeah, so we're not only collecting those multiple UTM parameters, but we're doing some of the math for you in that scenario. So I'd like to bring Tyler in, and Tyler is going to cover some of the questions that we've received, and we will go over those and round out this webinar.
Yeah, we had a few good questions go in as you all were going through everything. One of the first ones that came up was, should I use built-in UltraCart browser pixel or tag manager?
I'll take that one, Chris, or do you want me to?
Jonathan, go ahead. I'm having some strange computer problems.
Okay, so I will go ahead. Our personal recommendation is go ahead and use the UltraCart provided conversion pixel. So if you're configuring AdWords or Google or Facebook and all that, go ahead and let us serve up our pixels. And the reason being is we've coded the actual conversion pixel to have the same data points that the browser pixel is going to serve up to match the same data points that the server side pixels that we give do. And so that is important because the deduplication will take place. The deduplication will take place on the network if they're the exact same. So you can use Tag Manager for any other type of advertising network that we don't intrinsically support, but our recommendation is not to use Tag Manager for anything that we have built-in support for.
Yep, agreed.
Awesome. All right, and then we had a question about another service. Somebody said that they had heard of Stape.io for server-side tracking. Do you all have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Stape is a really great service, actually, if you don't have some of the capabilities UltraCart has. It can also be useful in different scenarios where you have complicated sites that are outside of UltraCart where UC analytics can't be deployed for some reason, and you need to use Tag Manager. It allows Tag Manager to actually serve server side to the client, so it serves from their own domain, so it's first party, and it helps feed some data back server side. We have stopped using it on our site as well as most of our clients because the built-in UltraCart Analytics does such a better job of that tracking. But Stape is a great service, but you don't need most of Tag Manager once you have proper setup in UC tracking.
Awesome. All right, next is, should I fire a browser pixel or server-side pixels?
These days, the best recommendation is fire both. The server-side pixels tend to be very bulletproof, but you know, the network will deduplicate. So there's never a scenario, if take TikTok, for example, there's never a scenario where TikTok is going to see the browser pixel and the server-side pixel and attribute two different sales. So they're going to deduplicate on the order ID. It's just it's a good it's a good idea just to let both of them fire and not try to suppress one or the other. The benefit of that server side pixel is when you have the delayed conversion. So
Mhm.
think accounts receivable retry. We didn't mention it, but the server side pixel also lets us report for recurring billing transactions. So for example, on Facebook, we're able to report back the rebills of those orders so that you can look at your advertising spending over the life cycle of the customer as opposed to just the one first sale. So yeah, you should definitely do both.
Awesome. What other events besides conversion is UltraCart firing?
So the storefront visual builder, which powers your checkout, is going to fire a number of events. We're going to fire page views are fired on any page that we inject their tracking at. We're going to fire a view item event. We're going to fire add to cart events. We're going to fire an initiate checkout. So as they actually start, not just click on the checkout, that's not initiate. Initiate checkout as they start filling something out. So we're going to fire the initiate checkout, and then we're going to, some of them have a payment information added, and then some of them also have a what's the word I'm looking for? They have the final conversion or the complete payment. So there's a number of events we're going to fire. Think of them as a funnel, and the platforms help you monitor how far down the funnel the customer made it.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. All right. And then the last question that came in was, do you have an opinion on attribution? Do you track the first click of attribution or the last click, or do you split it? And if it is split, is it 40 for the first and 40 for the last, and maybe the middle gets 20%? Do you have an opinion about the way that should be assigned?
Unfortunately, in real world webinars, Chris had an internet issue there. So he probably will rejoin us and he can chime in. There he is. Welcome back.
Do it.
The question is, what's our opinion on what type of attribution? And in the early simplistic days, all you were collecting was one set of UTM parameters, and so you were basically doing last click attribution. In this big data type world, we're collecting all the UTM parameters, and in our opinion, giving them all some credit is worthwhile because they all contributed to the journey of the customer. Now, Chris flashed a screenshot up there where you saw those attribution calculation columns in BigQuery. We actually follow the older Google model of first guy gets 40, last guy gets 40, and every click in between splits the 20. So if you only had 2 clicks, they're going to be 50-50. If you had 3 clicks, it's going to be 40-20-40, 4 clicks, 40-10-10-40, and so on. So I think the bottom line, and this is where the big data analysis comes in, is understanding your funnel, understanding where to spend within the funnel, and the critical one, not accidentally cutting off your top of funnel because you don't think it's converting, when in reality, the top of funnel could be driving, a tremendous amount of the traffic. You might be advertising on Facebook and advertising on Google and closing with Facebook retargeting, etc. So, before you make any radical changes in your advertising spending because of attribution, make sure you understand, how those are converting.
My philosophy time has been that as far as the advertising platforms themselves, I always want them each to see the full conversion happening because I want them to see the full value. And then I use our reporting and truth that against. I believe that's the right way to go rather than trying to manually divvy up, giving Facebook a little bit and Google a little bit or whatever it is. I like to give maximum credit because I want that algorithm to be encouraged and to continue to do what it's going to do. Both those platforms on their own side will distribute. If there's 2 Google clicks, they're going to use, Google's going to distribute that click between that sale between those two clicks, Facebook as well. So it's important that if you start getting much, you may have a campaign, say in, as Jonathan mentioned, Google, that's actually driving a lot of the initial contact, and Facebook's closing it. And maybe they've seen 3 Facebook ads, but one Google ad started it. If you try to manually blend those and give it back, you're going to give Google this event, and you're going to win. And maybe that's how you want to do it. But I know that Google started it, and I want Google to drive me more customers, and that can happen in both ways. So it's always a discussion we have with clients. There's no one right way, and I think there's as many opinions on attribution as there are people that work on the internet. But that's my philosophy, and UltraCart's maybe the only platform in the world where you get to actually control some of that and actually observe how it's actually behaving.
Yeah, there's definitely some religious discussions around attribution. So either get a good coffee or a good beer. I'm not sure which, depending on how much you're spending, but yeah. So
Awesome.
all right.
Well, that wraps up the questions that came in today. So
All right. We appreciate everyone's time. We will be following up with a copy of the webinar as well as the next topic that we'll be discussing for November. So everyone
right.
have a great Halloween, and we will talk to you on the next one.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.